Got it. Yes, I know. And bring that up. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Just nod if you can. Or somebody give me, okay, great, great. Leslie's nodding. That's what I want. Thank you. All right, so I'll start this. So thanks everybody for coming to this course. I think I know absolutely everybody here, so I don't have to do an introduction for you guys. And I think a lot of you have been in other presentations I've done. So I've done a lot of presentations for Love Living at Home. I do have a background in 16th and 17th century English history. And this particular course, the History of London course, I've actually taught numerous times for other organizations and groups. So I was really thrilled to be able to dust it off, bring it out, and present it to people here. It is 8 weeks long. It is being recorded, as you know, so I know that 8 weeks is a big time commitment, so you can find it on the Love Living at Home YouTube channel. If you can't make every session, that's fine. But over the next 8 weeks, we're going to be looking at London, and we're going to cover a period from 43 AD all the way up to the present day. So we're going to go on quite a journey, as it were. And this is the course is kind of a mixture of political, social, and architectural history. And we'll focus on the history of some of the best known landmarks that you might already know, like Westminster Cathedral and the Tower of London. But we're also going to delve into some lesser known aspects of London. I like to uncover things that people may not be as familiar with. Each week, we're going to focus on a particular era. So we're going to look at the remains of Roman ruins. We're going to look at the theaters of Shakespeare's London, the effects of the Great Fire of 1666, Charles Dickens' London, London during the war years, and we'll go all the way up through the new millennium. Now, for myself, I first set foot in London almost 50 years ago. It was the first time I'd been out of the United States. It was the first time I'd been anywhere without my parents. I was still sort of young. I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I didn't even have a place to stay when I arrived in London. But from the second my feet hit the ground in that city, I can't explain it. I was utterly, utterly in love. And I've traveled to a lot of countries in the last 50 years since going to London. And there are 2 or 3 other cities that I really adore around the world, but nothing caught my heart quite the way London did and still does. I've been back 25, 26 times now, and been very lucky in the last few years, pre-COVID, to be able to spend several weeks at a time over there, now that I'm retired and have some flexibility. But I'm always learning more things about the city. I still really love the city, and so I hope to share some of that with you today. So the course overview. This is a slide lecture, as most of my talks are. But I do welcome your participation, including any comments or questions that you have. In fact, I would really encourage you to ask questions. You can, during the class, put them in the chat down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just type them in down there. And also at the end of the session, I'll leave a few minutes so we can kind of have a Q&A during that time too. And if there's anything I can't answer, and I'm sure there may be, I will get back to you the following week with answers if you have a question that I can't answer at the time. Each week, you will get a packet of material with pertinent historical dates, maybe location lists of where we're talking about, key players, suggested supplemental readings. These materials are available on the Love Living at Home website, and the office will also send them out via an email link. So you can find them if you go to the calendar, to the events calendar each week. They'll be there. There'll be links there. If you're on Village Talk, they're also there. And again, Leslie will send them out via email. So you'll have those every week. Okay, so before we get started, in terms of housekeeping, I would just ask that if you haven't already done so, please mute yourself throughout the lecture until we get to the Q&A period at the end. As I was saying just a minute ago, that noise can be really distracting for your fellow participants and also for me. If you need any help muting your microphone, I think by now you're probably all veterans at doing this. Leslie can help you with that too. And again, any questions you have, any comments you want to make, just put them in the chat box or you can hold them until the end. Okay, so mute your mics and let's get going. So the agenda today, I'm going to start by just doing kind of a review of London, just a little overview of London, and then we're going to launch into Roman London, the Roman occupation. And we will look at the occupation, we'll look at what daily life was like, we'll look at some architecture, housing, commercial buildings, government and religious buildings. Surprisingly, there are still a few Roman ruins that you can see in London, and so we'll visit some of those. And then we'll talk very, very briefly about the end of Roman London when the Romans pulled out of what was then Britannia. So to start with, now I am sure most of you are very familiar with this already, but just in case, just to orient ourselves. So London is, of course, the capital of the UK, and it's in the first map here on the left, you can see where it's located. It's in the southeast of England, and it's right on that very famous River Thames that we see here. It has a population of almost 9,000. I'm sorry, 9 million. And it's made up of 32 boroughs, plus the city of Westminster and the city of London. And we're going to be talking a lot about the city of London, which is right smack in the middle of this map here. It's only 1 square mile in size, but it's very significant, and we'll be talking a lot about that. So this is a map with the different boroughs that you can see. They're administrative units. They each have their own local councils, and those councils are responsible for things like collecting taxes, overseeing garbage and recycling collection, maintaining roads, operating libraries, granting local planning permission. They're also in charge of any social housing, affordable housing, that kind of thing. Most of the boroughs also have their own mottos and coats of arms, because some of them go back a ways. And I find that a lot of them have their own flavor and distinctive style. So at one time I heard London described as being a city of villages, and to an extent, I think that's really true. So the kind of feeling that you might get in Southwark or in Greenwich, south of the river, it could be very, very different from the feeling that you might get up in Enfield in the north, as you can see on this map. Now, for the city of London itself, that bit right in the middle I talked about, whenever I refer to the city of London, think of it with a capital C. That's that 1 square mile. It's the historic center of London. It's also the financial district. It sits right in the middle, as you can see. It has its own government, so it has its own mayor. The mayor of London is not the mayor of the city of London. They have their own Lord Mayor. Their mayor, this right was given to them all the way back in 1215 by King John. They have their own city hall, their own taxes, even their own police. And this is really where London began. So we're going to be talking a lot about the city of London, particularly in the first few weeks of this course. Now, as for London's governance, we'll go into that in a little more detail at the very end of the course. In terms of population, as I mentioned, it's about 9 million, so it's similar to New York City. And like New York City, it's very multicultural. There are over 300 different languages spoken in schools. You've got the standard European languages like French, German, Italian, Spanish, Polish, Russian. But then you also have Punjabi, Bengali, Somali, Arabic, Tamil, Pashto, an Afghan language. It's also very diverse religiously. So Christians, Jews, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, Sikhs, anybody you can think of, all working and living alongside each other. Where London does differ from New York City is in its landmass. So that city of London, that little 1 square mile, that's very small. London itself covers a vast area. It covers 608 square miles. And if we compare that to the boroughs in New York City, they're only about 305 square miles. So it's similar in population to New York, but it's much more spread out. And we'll see as we go through this course how it spreads out. The other thing I wanted to mention before we launch into our discussion of Roman London today is the various names that London has held over the centuries. So Londinium, that is the name that the Romans gave it. And then Lundenwig, which we'll talk about next time, that was the Anglo-Saxon name, kind of market town. And then various spellings of London, as you can see. And then 2 nicknames that came up. One still some sticks a little bit, but it's kind of old-fashioned now, is the Old Smoke. And that referred to the air pollution, the smog from the coal burning and that kind of thing, the fog and smog. And the other one is really not very flattering at all. It's called the Great Wen. I don't think anyone uses this anymore. But the Great Wen was penned by a radical champion of rural life, a guy named William Cobbett. He called London this in the 1820s. He wrote about London in the 1820s and called it the Great Wen. And this was his reaction to the growing size of London. And again, when we get to the Victorian lecture, you'll see what he was talking about. And a wen, of course, is like a growth on your face or someplace on your body. So he saw London as a growth on the face of England, an ugly growth on the face of England, and hence the nickname the Great Wen. Okay, so before we start with the Roman occupation, I do want to talk a little bit about the prehistoric period, just very briefly. There has been evidence of prehistoric settlements in this part of the UK, dating back to 450,000 BC, way back. So we know that there were people living here in this area that we call London before the Romans arrived. And for millennia, there'd be these small tribes that kind of went all over the place, and they fished in the Thames. And archaeologists have discovered certain things that lead them to this, but there's no strong evidence of a permanent settlement around London. They never found a permanent settlement. They do believe that London's prehistoric landscape was similar to today's Central African plains, so it was tropical and it would have dry and wet seasons. And they also say, it is said, that 125,000 years ago, hippos were wandering around Trafalgar Square. So much different than we would look at it today. But again, there are, when they were building Terminal 5 out at Heathrow Airport, which is not right in London, but near, workers uncovered fragments of a Neolithic monument, and they found some bronze spearheads. And in one part of London, along the river, archaeologists discovered a 6,000-year-old Mesolithic timber pile that was stuck deep into the Thames foreshore. So again, obvious evidence that there was some kind of prehistoric life in this area. But today we're here to talk about the Romans. And it was really the Romans who created London. Julius Caesar, the guy on the left here, he invaded Britain twice, in 55 BC and again in 54 BC. Didn't get very far on his first attempt. Now, during the second invasion, he did manage to subdue some British tribes, and he established what's called client kings. And these client kings, were subservient to Rome, and they had to pay tribute to Rome. Basically, they had to pay protection money, if you would, and then supposedly Rome would protect them. But it really wasn't until 43 AD when Claudius, the Emperor Claudius, who you see in the middle here, and those of you who remember the BBC TV series I, Claudius, this is Claudius, he sent 4 legions from Rome to launch a full-scale invasion in advance of occupying what became Britannia. And that's when London was established. Now, the excuse that Claudius gave for invading Britain was in part because some of these client kings were stirring up trouble. They weren't paying payment. They weren't paying their tribute payment to Rome. So that was one excuse for it. As we know, the empire was very vast, the Roman Empire. Another reason is Claudius was actually attracted by some of the natural resources in Britannia. So things like tin and silver and copper and iron, and even a little bit of gold was found. Now, the original capital during Roman times initially was actually in what is now Colchester. So it's over here, it's just north of London. It's about 66 miles north of London in Essex. And this map here on the right shows you the Roman names for the cities that were established in Britannia during that. So initially, London was not the capital, Colchester was. So around 47, 48 AD, Londinium was established. And at this time, it was really little more than a camp on the north side of the River Thames, in the kind of current Cornhill area here and Ludgate Hill. So not too far from the Tower of London, if you know London at all. And it had a suburb across the river, which you don't really see in this map, but over here in what is now Southwark, there was a little suburb over there, But this map does kind of show you the parameters of Roman London, except that suburb, kind of laid over a map of current day London. London was not a military settlement per se. There were troops well, Londinium, I should say, in Londinium. And there was a garrison at one point, and you can see it up here in this map. Here, you can see where the garrison is, the fort. But really, the Romans used Londinium's location along the Thames more as a trading post, because boats could move easily up and down the river. They could go straight out to the North Sea. So it was a really great area for the empire to develop a port. And you can see on here some of the places we will be visiting and talking about, the Forum, the amphitheater, we'll see a Roman bath down here, some other things. So what was daily life like? Well, London grew very, very quickly in the first decade. And by about 50 AD, shortly after the Romans settled, there were about 10,000 people living in this new city. And it very soon became the center of administration for the province of Britannia. It was a cultural melting pot, like today. So people from every part of the Roman Empire came. So continental Europe, Asia, the Middle East, Africa, they all came in here to help run this new province. There would have been administrators, merchants, soldiers, craft workers, and they probably would have brought their families with them, a lot of them. So what we saw was a population that was a mixture of civilians, families, soldiers, sailors, people working, and slaves. They had a 7-day work week. It wasn't an easy work life for most Roman Londoners, so they had to work very long hours to make a living. They would usually rise at dawn. They'd only probably stop for a lunchtime snack. But there were numerous festivals and feast days to honor the gods, so they did have some time for leisure activity that allowed them to have a break. So although they lived in kind of cramped and small housing, and they usually had their workshops attached to their houses or their shops attached to their houses, they did know how to enjoy themselves. They would go to the baths. There were taverns they would go to. They would go to the amphitheater, which we'll talk about a little later, to seek entertainment there. And during this time, the Romans started really building up an infrastructure for the city, something they were so well known for. So roads were developed. And these would have been hard-packed gravel, and they'd have drainage ditches on either side of them. And the riverbanks would have been shored up to prevent erosion. So they really started laying the foundation for a real city here. There would have been wooden residential housing, as I said before, and then commercial buildings were cropping up, particularly warehouses along the river and wharfs lining the river. This is a picture that I took from the Museum of London. This is a model of what the riverside would have looked like with these warehouses during the Roman time period. And the only bridge at that time crossing the Thames was that original London Bridge that you see here. So this kind of gives you an idea of the flavor of what it would have looked like. The residential houses would have been very tightly packed, separated by narrow alleyways, and they would have had shops and workshops attached to them. And excavations that have been done uncovered evidence of leatherworking, pottery kilns, glassworks, shoemaking. So again, we get a flavor of what kind of industry, what kind of crafts were going on at this time. The average Roman house would have had small backyards with outbuildings for pigs and chickens and that kind of thing as well. But it would have been they would have been pretty densely packed in, the average person. Now, wealthier citizens, as always, would have had houses or villas located away from that very crowded area. And they would have been decorated in the Roman fashion. So they would have mosaic flooring and wall paintings and even underfloor heating. Again, this is a photo I took in the Museum of London, and this depicts a typical room in a wealthier home around 300 AD, a Roman London home around 300 AD. Now, the furniture are replicas. These are not originals, but the artifacts, all the pottery on this table here, they are all originals that were found during excavations. And the wall painting, the paintings you see on the wall, these were based on plaster fragments from Austin Friars in the city of London. Austin Friars was a 13th century monastery, but it was probably built on top of a Roman ruin because they did find some of these wall plasters that suggested Roman paintings on them. So they recreated that for the walls. And then in the same room is this amazing mosaic floor. It's a really a remarkable example. It was found on Queen Victoria Street in the city of London back in 1869. It's made of stone and ceramic. Obviously, some of it has been recreated and rehabbed, if you will, but it was picked up piece by piece and moved over to the Museum of London and recreated for this room. So speaking of mosaics, this is one of the most recent finds, and it's been quite a discovery. This is in Southwark, south side of the river, as I said, where that kind of suburb was. Now, archaeologists already knew there were Roman buildings in this area because back in the 1980s, they did some excavating on a site right next to this one, but they never expected to find anything as amazing as this. This is a nearly intact Roman mosaic floor. They call it a once in a lifetime find in London. And it was kind of a fluke of history that they were able to find this in such good condition. And that's because this area in Southwark, this was kind of left as fields until the 17th century. So it was really kind of just barren field land. And then the buildings that were built on it in the 17th century, they tended to have very shallow basements. So nobody was digging down far enough to disrupt any of this Roman history. They found two large segments. You can see here, two large segments. The one on the left is kind of the main rectangular, and they think this may have been used as a dining room. And then the smaller square on the right may have sat in the recess of the room itself. Now, the dining room, or what the Romans call a triclinium, this would have contained dining couches where people would sit to eat. The rooms would have been very brightly painted, and remarkably, some fragments of very fragile wall plaster have survived and been recovered by archaeologists on this Southwark site. So again, pretty amazing. This is obviously an artist's rendition of what one of these rooms would have looked like. One thing I'll say about the Romans, both in London and elsewhere, when we look at these ruins, when we look at Roman statues in museums and things, they all look quite plain. You know, they look concretey, or they look gray. They don't look very colorful. But in reality, in Roman times, in the Roman Empire, everything was very colorful. The walls were colored, there'd be inlaid marble, the statues would be painted, and we even see this somewhat in the medieval period. So what you see today isn't necessarily what it looked like in the time period. This is a recreation, again, of another room, another dining room in a museum in Europe. So you can see what a Roman dining room would have looked like. Let me go back to this for just a minute. So that larger piece of flooring on the left we see here, this has been dated to the late 2nd, early 3rd century AD. But they found an even older mosaic beneath it now. So they think that this mosaic that you see on the left here probably covered up an older one, just like when we renovate our houses and put in new flooring or rip up our carpets or do whatever. The one on the left is about 24 feet long. So this room would have been particularly large for London. So the archaeological team believed that this was probably used by upper class members of Roman society in London. And again, they're on the other side of the river, right? They're not crowded in that 1 square mile. The dig also unearthed the site of another large Roman building with traces of underfloor heating, elaborately painted walls, mosaics, coins, jewelry, again, pointing to a very wealthy domicile. Now, at the moment, these mosaics were moved off site, they're being restored, so conservation work, but there are plans in place now to, I believe, put them back in situ, put them back more or less where they were found, and create some type of a visitor center where people can come and see them. Okay. Under Cannon Street Station, the tube station, the underground station, subway station, if you will, in London, they have found evidence of the governor's palace. Now, this is an artist rendition by a guy named Alan Sorrell. He's an English artist who works with archaeologists to interpret what Roman ruins would have looked like in the city of London. And so this is his rendition of what this governor's palace would have looked like. So some of that is under the Cannon Street tube station. some things we will never see, some things will remain buried, but it's interesting to have this artist rendition based on what they did find. And this is just a 3D model. I try to credit whenever I take anything off the internet. A lot of these photos are my own. I can't remember where I got this one from, so apologies if somebody, if the creator somehow stumbles across this on YouTube. I couldn't find it again. But what it does show you very clearly is over here, here are some of the domestic housing, and you can see again how closely packed they are with these little tiny alleyways between them. The riverside down here with the warehouses, the amphitheater here that we'll be talking about, the forum that we'll be talking about. So they did a really nice job on this. And then, since I mentioned the south side of the river in Southwark and that mosaic, I did want to mention something else over there. In June of 2017, a Roman stone sarcophagus was found on a site that was being excavated in Southwark. And when they moved it off site, the combined weight of the base and the lid that you can see here on the left was 2.5 tons, so incredibly heavy. Now, Roman Londoners were either cremated or buried in coffins. Of the latter, most were buried in wooden coffins or shrouds, but a small number of very wealthy Roman Londoners were buried in these stone sarcophagi, and they would have had these heavy stone lids on top of them. And in the stone sarcophagus, often there would be a lead coffin, and that's where the body was kept, inside of that lead coffin. Only 3 of these have been excavated in London in the last 30 years. So again, quite a find. When they found this one, the lid was cracked and it had been moved. They could tell it had been moved sometime in the past. So there was speculation that the coffin had been robbed, not uncommon, grave robbers. But there were still contents in the sarcophagus, including the near complete skeleton of an adult woman, some bones of an infant, and 2 remaining pieces of jewelry. So this could have been a woman who died shortly after childbirth, or a mother and child who died during some sort of plague that was going around. They're not sure. And these are the 2 pieces of jewelry that they found. On the left is a little fragment of gold, possibly from a necklace or an earring. And then on the right is just this small oval of jasper. This would have been set into a ring, kind of like a cameo. So good, big finds. Now, when archaeologists come across these human remains, what do they do with them? Well, the Museum of London curates over 20,000 archaeological derived human skeletal remains. And again, they're constantly coming up with these things whenever they're digging up London. So they take them to the Museum of London. The Museum of London has a Center for Human Bioarchaeology, and they oversee all of the remains. Okay, let's get to some history. So for the first 10 years or so, Londinium was pretty stable, doing really well. But in 60-61 AD, this woman that you see here, she led a revolt, and that really shook things up. So this is Boudica. Some people spell it with only 1 C, some people pronounce it differently, her name differently, but I call her Boudica. She was the wife of Prasutagus, who was the king, a client king that I mentioned before, this deal with Rome, a client king of an East Anglian tribe called the Iceni, or the Iceni. Now, we only have 2 sources of Boudica's story, and they're primary sources, but they actually were both written after this event. So they're primary, but neither of these historians were actually there at the time this happened. The first story comes from Publius Cornelius Tacitus, a Roman historian, and some of you might be familiar with Tacitus. Tacitus's father-in-law was a general who was believed to have been instrumental in one of the battles against Boudica. The other historian is a guy named Cassius Dio, or sometimes Dio Cassius. He was a Roman statesman and a historian. Of the 2 accounts we have of Boudica, Tacitus is thought to be the most reliable, given the fact that his father-in-law was involved with one of these big battles with Boudica, called the Battle of Watling Street. But in reality, neither Tacitus nor Cassius Dio were around at this time. So according to Tacitus, Boudica, you see here with her 2 daughters, and you can see the one daughter very clearly here. The other daughter, you can just see her head peeking around here. According to Tacitus, Boudica's husband had this client-king relationship with Rome. When he died, he had no male heirs. And as part of this agreement, he had left half of his lands to his 2 daughters, and the other half to the Emperor Nero. And the understanding was, again, that Nero would come under, he would protect Boudica and her daughters. But after the death of Prasutagus, Rome annexed his lands, defiled his daughters, according to Tacitus, and flogged Boudica, flogged his wife. Now, Tacitus tells us that this is what spearheaded Boudica's revolt. Dio Cassius, on the other hand, claims that the uprising centered around a dispute over a loan. He never mentions in his accounts the flogging of Boudica or the raping of her daughters. So they have two very different stories. What we do know for certain is that this was a native-led revolt, quite an amazing revolt. I mean, supposedly anywhere from Boudica was able to get all these different tribes involved, anywhere from 80 to 120,000 people, they said. Although we know that Tacitus can sometimes, I think Tacitus, can't remember if it was Tacitus or Cassius Dio, one of them do tend to exaggerate numbers sometimes. But anyway, it was a large revolt. And they burned Colchester, the capital. They burned St. Albans, another large settlement near London, and they burned London. And this was, of course, people didn't want to be occupied, just like today, people don't want to be occupied, so it didn't take much to stir people up, particularly with this kind of thing. But Boudica's success was short-lived. The Romans gained control during the Battle of Watling Street, the one that Tacitus's father-in-law was said to have fought in. And Boudica died shortly thereafter. Cassius said she died of an illness. Tacitus claims she committed suicide by taking poison so that she would not be captured by the Romans and paraded through the streets. This was seen as an honorable way to die. In any event, her death does seem to have put an end to the rebellion. The rebellion was kind of dead on the ground after that. And at the time of her death, we believe she was only about 29 or 30 years old. Now, today she's still considered something of a folk hero, and her role in the rebellion was never forgotten. Queen Victoria herself was considered Boudica's namesake because both of their names mean victory, Victoria and Boudica. And the sculpture you see here, the statue, this is Boudica and her daughters. It was begun in the 1850s. And actually, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were involved in its commission. Some say the face was modeled on Victoria. I don't know if that's true. The sculptor was a guy named Thomas Thornycraft, and he completed a full-size model of the statue by the time he died in 1885. But it wasn't until 1902 that this statue was actually installed atop a granite plinth in Westminster. It's right across from the Houses of Parliament, so she's looking right over at Parliament, at the government. And it remains a big tourist attraction today, and it's on a lot of postcards. So Boudica burns the place down. The Romans did win the day, but the rebuilding of London was kind of slow in coming. Not surprising, their first priority was to repair the roads and reconstruct the riverside wharfs because they needed trade and commerce. And that's when a military installation surrounded by defensive ditches was created. And this was created around 65 AD. You can see it up here. Historians also believe that this was the time when the capital shifted, when they were rebuilding these towns, shifted from Colchester to London. And the reason they think that is, first of all, they have this fortress now, and it was said to hold between 500 and 800 troops. But also archaeologists uncovered a huge temple to an imperial cult. And one of the key indicators of Colchester's status prior to the Boudican Revolution was their imperial cult temple. So having an imperial cult temple was a big deal. The fact that the Romans now built one in London, along with other buildings that we're about to look at, like the Colosseum and the Forum, this suggests that they now regarded London as their new political headquarters. More slowly, you started to see residential buildings being built. And by about 100 AD, the city was rebuilt. It was thriving. Population was up to 60,000, which was really quite large for that time period. Now, like all Roman cities, important cities, Londinium consisted of a forum that you see over here. So the forum was there. There was an amphitheater. There were temples, and there's a bathhouses all over the place, the governor's palace that we talked about, the Temple of Mithras, which we're going to look at later. So it had all of the common things that we would see in a large Roman city. Unlike Rome, however, if you've been to Rome, that's, it's virtually an outdoor museum. You walk around and there's the Colosseum hitting you in the face. There's the ruins of the Forum right there. Most of the Roman presence in London has disappeared, but there are still sections that you can see today, um, all within that 1 square mile, mostly, and mostly underground. So let's look at a few of these. So let's start with the Basilica and the Forum. It was originally built in AD 70, and then it was expanded between 90 and 120. Now, when we hear the word basilica, what do we think of? A church, right? That's what we usually identify it with. But in Roman times, the basilica was a civic center. So this is a model of the basilica, but the basilica is just one end of it here. This whole thing is not the basilica, but it would have been a civic center. So it was home to city administrators, to law courts. There'd be an assembly hall. There'd be the treasury would be kept here. There'd be shrines. And at the height, when this was built in London, it was the largest building of its type north of the Alps. It occupied nearly 5 acres of land. It stood at a height of 3 stories, which back in that time for London was like a skyscraper today. It was larger than the present day St. Paul's Cathedral. That's how big it was. And again, because of the size of it, it really indicated the importance of London within the Roman Empire. So you can see, again, the basilica is just at this one end. It's a long structure with it's rectangular in shape. It would have been, if you were inside it, it would have been split into aisles by columns. So there'd be a center aisle, and then there'd be columns on each side and side aisles, covered by a roof, obviously. And there would have been a raised platform at one end, usually the east end. That was known as the tribune. This is where the magistrate would sit, or there might be a statue of the emperor. And there'd be windows up above on that 3rd story that would allow light to kind of penetrate down into the structure itself. But as I said, the basilica is not the whole structure. It's only one side of the Roman Forum. So you can see this large open air area here, and this would have been a gathering place to socialize, to do business. There would have been market stalls and shops, a really lively, noisy place, and then other administrative buildings and things, and temples, lots of temples and things going on around the rest of the Forum. This is a 3D model that shows you what the Roman Forum, or what the Basilica at the Roman Forum in Rome would have looked like, they believe. And again, you can see rectangular in shape, 3 stories, windows at the top that spill light down in, and of course lined with all these important figures and emperors and things there. And then finally, I do want to show you the Basilica of Santa Sabina. This is in the Aventine Hill area in Rome. And this dates back to 432 AD. So this picture, unfortunately, is a little spread out. It's not quite as wide as it looks in this picture. But again, it kind of gives you an idea of why we call churches basilicas. Some of these, especially in the early medieval period, it really was the model for churches: the center aisle, the side aisles, the arches, the light that we call the clear story. These windows, we refer to them in church architecture as clear story windows, and the light comes down in through. And we'll see this when we look at Westminster Abbey, how the Roman basilica really influenced the building of some of these. So Londinium's basilica and forum were destroyed in the early 4th century. There's some debate over how this happened. Some historians assert that it was destroyed by Rome as a punishment for London supporting a rogue emperor, Carausius, but we don't really know. But it was destroyed. However, a little bit of it can be found, of all places, in the basement of the Nicholson and Griffin Hair Salon on the corner of Gracechurch Street and Leadenhall Market in the city of London. And this is on one of those handouts if you're really curious. I'm sorry, this picture is so blurry, but this is all that remains of the basilica. If you ask really nicely and they're not too busy, they might let you sneak down into their basement and take a peek at it. Or you can get your hair cut, go for a shampoo and a haircut and blow dry, and then they might be more inclined to let you take a look. But it's kind of cool that you can still see part of this here. So the amphitheater, this was also in the 1st century when an amphitheater was built in London. It was originally a wooden structure, wasn't discovered until 1988, when the present Guildhall Art Gallery was being redeveloped. And again, like all the Roman ruins we're discussing today, in the city of London, in that 1 square mile in the city of London. And this is again a rendition of what an amphitheater would look like, not the one in London necessarily, but. The arena was rebuilt in stone around 120 AD. Again, the walls would have been decorated with plaster, really brightly colored paint, inlaid marble. The rest of the amphitheater, which included tiered seating, was made of timber, and it was estimated that there would have been seating for as many as 7,000 spectators. So again, the mark of an important city. And it would have been in the open air. You know, if you've been to the Colosseum or you've seen these, obviously there's no roof over these. Events would have included wild animal fights, the execution of criminals, and professional gladiator shows. The stone threshold in one of the one of the eastern entrance chambers had deeply cut slots, and it held a sliding trap door. And that's how the animals would have been brought up and released into the arena. And then in the autumn of 1999, the Museum of London discovered the southern entrance to the amphitheater. There were two public gateways that led from the street into where the seating would have been. But very interestingly enough, and somewhat of a mystery to this day, I believe, they found a male skeleton buried beneath the entrance. And no one's quite sure who this person was or why this person was buried there. The Romans always buried their dead outside the city walls. They never buried their dead within the city walls. And any gladiator or prisoner killed would not have been buried right there at the amphitheater. So a puzzle to this day. But you can see, if you go to the Guildhall Art Gallery, you can go downstairs in the basement again, and you can see some of the remains of the Roman amphitheater. Now here's another shot, a little bit of the remains in the foreground, but I wanted to, I took this picture and wanted to point this out because this is how they've interpreted the space in kind of a very interesting way. So you see these green projections in the background, and they're meant to represent the gladiators who would have fought in this space. So you can see even the tiered seating. You see they've only got one spectator here, but someone obviously getting decked, someone looking victorious, some other people fighting, maybe someone waiting to go on. We don't know. But it's very interesting how they've interpreted this. We're going to come back to the Guildhall later in this course because it has a very interesting history of its own a little later on. But again, go down to the basement, you can see this. Another really interesting artifact from the 1st century AD can be found in the courtyard of St. Magnus the Martyr Church. In the courtyard, you can find this piece of wooden Roman wharf. This dates back to 75 AD. They've done dating on the wood, and it goes all the way back to 75 AD. It was discovered all the way up here on Fish Street Hill, far from the river now. But this just goes to show you how much the river has been enclosed and narrowed. And we'll talk about a lot later, we'll talk about that, why that happened over the centuries. This is where the current Church of St. Magnus the Martyr is now. But it would have been right by London Bridge, right by the bridge at that time. Now, if we move to the 2nd century AD, I mentioned in the introduction the Great Fire of London. Some of you are probably familiar with that incident. We're going to be coming back to that later, obviously. But in reality, this was just one of a series of devastating fires for London. I talked about Boudicca's rebellion that resulted in a fire that destroyed London in 60 AD. And then around 125 AD, there was another fire, and that one destroyed 1/5 of the city. And we refer to this as the Hadrianic fire because Hadrian was the emperor at that time, emperor of Rome during that period. We don't know much about the fire, but we know it was very, very destructive. And it was after this fire that a substantial stone city wall was built. We don't know the exact date, but we believe it's around 200 AD, and it was connected to that Roman fort that I pointed out on the map earlier. The wall was built of ragstone from Kent, so it was transported on barges. The stones were transported on barges up the River Medway, where it connected with the Thames estuary. It was almost 2 miles long, pretty much marked the boundaries for what we now know as the City of London. And since it was a protective perimeter around the city, there were a series of gates leading into the city. And the names of those gates are still part of London today. So if you go to London, you will see underground stations and streets with names like Aldgate, Bishopsgate, Newgate, Ludgate, Cripplegate. And then later, 6th and 7th gates were added, so Aldersgate and Moorgate. Aldersgate around 350 AD, and Moorgate not until the medieval period, not until about around 1415, I believe. And again, you can see if we go back to this map, you can see where the gates were. So Ludgate, Newgate, Aldersgate. You can see where some of these gates were around the city. And again, just to point out, the Romans always buried their dead outside the city walls. They did not bury them within the city. So there's several spots in the city where you can see part of this wall. The picture I showed you just a second ago, that was outside the Tower of London. There's a big selection there. Also by the Museum of London. Well, now the Museum of London is moving. It's not where it used to be, but by the old Museum of London, which I'll talk about in a minute, there's a good piece of the wall there. This is over by the Museum of London. The old Museum of London was, its former home, was on a road appropriately named London Wall. So this one's inside a gated garden. I couldn't go in there, but I could peek over and get a picture to show you. And you can see some of it's been added onto in other centuries in the medieval period. So you can tell it's not all original. It's been shored up. It's been added onto. This was taken from inside the Museum of London looking out. And again, you can see part of the wall there. There's even part of the wall under a parking lot, a parking garage that you can see in London. And there's another shot of it. All right, this one's really interesting. We want to move into the 3rd century now, and there are 2 sites I want to highlight. The first is the Temple of Mithras, and this dates back to 240 AD. And no, this building certainly doesn't look like it dates back to 240 AD, does it? Because it doesn't. And I'll talk about what this building is in a minute. So religion played a really large role in the life of Roman Londoners. We believe, although this is being somewhat debunked by some people, it's a little controversial now, but until very recently, it was believed that a temple to Diana sat near the present-day St. Paul's Cathedral, and likewise, a temple to Apollo is said to be on the site of the present-day Westminster Cathedral. Romans worshipped different gods for various reasons. Actually, probably Westminster Cathedral, yeah, which was actually outside that 1 square mile, interestingly enough. Romans worshiped different gods for various reasons. So if they needed help making decisions, they'd worship one type of god. If they needed help healing their injuries, they'd worship another type of god. So not unlike Roman Catholics, who would look for the patron saints of various things, tons of patron saints in the Catholic Church. There would also be household shrines in Roman homes. This was very common. You'd have your household gods, and you'd have a shrine to your household gods. But Mithras, who was Mithras? So he was a deity who actually goes all the way back to Persian and Greek times. And interestingly enough, he seems to have some parallels with Jesus Christ. His birthday is said to be on December 25th. He offered his followers salvation, and he appears to have undergone a type of rebirth in a cave. The religion cropped up in Roman history around the end of the 1st century AD, and by the 4th century, it pretty much disappeared. It was a mystery, what they call a mystery religion, so behind closed doors, wasn't open to everyone. It was an all-male cult, and one of the defining icons of the religion was of Mithras slaying a bull, which we'll look at in a minute. They had temples all over the Roman Empire. It's estimated that there were almost 700 of them in Rome alone. So this was a big religion for a while, even though it was a mystery religion and an all-male cult. It attracted soldiers, merchants, custom officials, minor bureaucrats, but few, if any, followers came from leading aristocratic or senatorial families. So that was kind of interesting. And again, we don't know why. I'm not a classicist. I'm certainly not an expert on Roman religious cults. So I'm not going to go into any more background on this religion, but there are plenty of materials online and in print if you want to read up more. If you're curious, just Google Mithras and you'll find all kinds of information. So back to the temple, it was originally unearthed in the early 1950s on a World War II bomb site in the city. It was a major discovery, and it really caused quite a buzz. It was estimated that more than 30,000 people would line up to see it on some days. And these are a couple of photos from that time period. And you can see on the right, the long, long line, the queue of people, massing to get in here. And then on the left, I'm hoping this isn't the general public, but it may have been. It may have been. Some of these ladies don't necessarily look like they're archaeologists working, but so I guess they let the public in there to look around as well. In 1962, there was a developer who wanted to build on this site. So the temple, sadly, was dismantled. Most of it was moved to a nearby parking lot, out in the open. Some of it, I believe, went to a garage someplace in Hertfordshire, I think. I don't know why it got split up. But anyway, it sat in this parking lot, most of it, until 2010. That building I showed you in the first photo, that modern building, the Bloomberg Company bought the property that this was originally founded on, the temple was originally founded on. And between 2012 and 2014, they undertook one of the most extensive archaeological excavations in London. They found more than 14,000 individual artifacts, including 63,000 shards of pottery, 3 tons of animal bones, all kinds of things that gave them evidence of trade, consumption, what kinds of food people would have eaten, the industry around there. And Michael Bloomberg, say what you will about him, and I'm not getting into politics at all, but Michael Bloomberg was really dedicated to preserving this part of London's history and giving it back to people. So the Bloomberg Company spent several years working with archaeologists to move and reassemble the temple in its original home before they built the Bloomberg European headquarters on top of it. And you can go in there today. It's free. You have to book a ticket online. And it's really quite interesting what they've done. So you go in the entrance, and on the first floor, on the main level, they have a big case, a showcase, and they've got a lot of the artifacts that they found, and they talk about them. They interpret them and talk about them. Then you go down one level, and they have touchscreen computers. They have information on the history of Mithras and the religion and that kind of thing. Then you go into the sub basement itself, all the way down, and you have to go in that part with a guide. And it's really quite interesting. So first of all, here, this is within the temple itself. Here is one image. This is Mithras slaying the bull. This is kind of a better shot of it. You can kind of see him slaying the bull here. But it's very interesting. So you go in completely in the dark. And I was like trying to take all these photos. I'm like, none of these photos are going to come out. Why did they bring us down here? You can't see anything. This is weird. And then you start hearing chanting, this kind of recorded chanting. And then a fog or a mist kind of comes up from the floor. So some people think it's a little Disney-fied or a little hokey, but I thought it was kind of interesting. And then finally, what I really loved is you start seeing these columns appear. And these are light. These are made from light. And this is to represent the Roman columns that would have been there. And then finally, the lights finally come up and you get to see everything. But so all of this experience is meant to give you a sense of what it would have been like to been in the temple at that time, because these temples they met underground. So I would highly recommend visiting it if you get a chance. Again, it's totally free. You just have to book a ticket online. And I do applaud Michael Bloomberg for caring enough about London's history to preserve this and put it back where it belonged. There are other temples to Mithras in Wales and Northumberland. We think there might be one in Colchester. They're not sure. And this is with the lights fully on, with none of the fancy light columns and things. It's pretty plain. There's not a lot left of it, unfortunately, because again, it got dismantled and sat out there. But they've done a really nice job of interpreting it, I think. All right, the other one I wanted to show you was a little less curated. This is the second site from the 3rd century. This is the Billingsgate Bathhouse. It's on Lower Thames Street, again in the city of London. It was discovered in 1848, so much, much earlier than the discovery of the Temple of Mithras. The site was granted a protected heritage site protection by the Ancient Monuments Act of 1882. This act ensured the protection of sites dating as far back as the Neolithic period. Now, bathing was really popular during Roman times, and nearly all cities would have had public bathhouses, open to all classes of society, both genders. This is a model of what archaeologists feel the bathhouse would have looked like. This is a plan from a bathhouse, and you can see that Roman bathhouses, first of all, the entrance fee was very modest. Sometimes on public holidays, you could even go in for free. People would come to bathe, they would read, they'd relax, they'd socialize. So a little like our spas today. And they consisted of a series of rooms, as you can see here. So you started out in the caldarium, which was the hot bath that you would go into first. And then you would kind of work your way through to the tepidarium, which was kind of a warm tepid bath. And then on to the frigidorium, which was the cold bath. You'd plunge into a cold bath. They had changing rooms. They had central heating, underfloor heating, quite, quite fancy in some cases. The bigger ones, the really big ones, the public ones, they might also have gardens and libraries, massage chambers, even lecture halls. But in addition to the public baths, it wasn't unusual for wealthy citizens to have their own private bathhouses attached to their villas. And in fact, this is what the Billingsgate bathhouse is. So the Billingsgate bathhouse would not have been as grand as some of the public baths, but still impressive. The bathhouse itself dates from the 3rd century, but the villa that it was attached to dates from the late 2nd century. So at some point in time, the owner of the villa decided to add the bathhouse. So again, same way we kind of do renovations today. Although the site was discovered in 1848, it wasn't until the early 1960s that extensive excavation work began. So it was discovered, but then covered up again. And that excavation work, which started in the 1960s, is still ongoing today. This is a plan of the local bathhouse. And again, you can see the various rooms. And this is the hypocaust system. So it was common in the Roman era to have underfloor heating, known as a hypocaust system. And this would have been fueled by wood furnaces. So basically there'd be these pipes that you can kind of see at the bottom here, and they would run from the furnace under the floors to heat the house. So as we've always known, the Romans were way ahead of their time. Now, again, during this time, the villa would have been much nearer to the river than it is now. So as I said, remember the river was a lot wider back then. This is very much a working archaeological site. Like the Temple of Mithras, it's beneath a current office building. It's only open on Saturdays. Tours are conducted by very knowledgeable City of London tour guides. You do have to buy a ticket, but it's a very nominal fee. And it's very interesting to walk around here. You can see they got the metal catwalks, and you can just kind of walk around and look down in at the various things. We do know that the building remained in use probably until the 5th century, but like the rest of Londinium, as we'll hear in a minute, after the Romans left, it fell to ruin. So here are a few more shots that I took. That's one of the wood burning furnace areas. And they had at one end, they have this big steel bookcase with all of these various boxes that are filled with tile, mostly tiles, that they're still, labeling and trying to reconstruct. This is really interesting. I love this one. A couple of interesting things were found on the site. An Anglo-Saxon brooch was found on one of the roof tiles. So that suggests that the villa and the bathhouse were most likely in ruins by 500 AD, because that's when the Anglo-Saxons were around. So you probably had somebody walking across these ruins, dropped their brooch. So we know it was in ruins by then. Otherwise, it wouldn't have ended up on a roof tile. But I love this. This is a dog's paw print. So, when you walk down city streets today, if somebody has repaved the pavement, sometimes you'll see dog or cat paw prints on there. This is a Roman dog paw print. I love it. Now, in addition to these sites, there are other places you can still see artifacts of Roman London in situ. Both St. Bride's Church and All Hallows by the Tower have artifacts in their crypts. So if you ever visit those churches, go down to the crypts. They have very interesting things down there. And you can see some flooring in this one. But like most London churches, they also have their own rich histories, and we're going to be talking about them later as well. This is the former Museum of London. This is a great place to see Roman artifacts. In fact, you can visit the whole history of London here. It's not here anymore. It closed recently. It is moving to a new site quite nearby, the old Smithfield's Meat Market, which we'll talk about later. But it is when they reopen, it's going to be fabulous. It was fabulous before, but it's going to be even better. And it's a great place to start exploring the history of London, if you will. They also have a second museum, I should say, in the Docklands out in the East End. That's also very interesting to visit. Okay, so I'm not going to say too much about the end of Roman Britain because to do so would really necessitate a larger discussion on the weakening and eventual collapse of the Western Roman Empire. That is not my area of expertise. So in a nutshell, in the late second and early third centuries, various parts of the empire had been fighting off attacks from a lot of different factions, including Goths and Vandals, and they were just under attack all over the place. In 410, the emperor at the time, he made the strategic decision. His name was Honorius. He decided, okay, I got to put my forces elsewhere. Britannia is not really worth it anymore. So Rome withdrew from Britain, which of course was very bad news for the locals because Britannia itself was under attack at this time from the north and from the east and from the west. And basically, the emperor said, bye, guys, you're on your own. You kind of figure it out for yourself. So what did this mean for London? In the third century, Londinium was a thriving city. It was 330 acres in size by that point, had a population of roughly 60,000 people, lots of trade and commerce coming in and out, very wealthy city. The Britons tried to fight off the invaders, but by 430, London was in tatters. Buildings were decaying and collapsing. The infrastructure had not been maintained. It was a real mess. And as we'll see next week, after the Romans left Britain, there was a great deal of instability, a lot of jockeying for power, several hundred years of various tribes and factions that came in and out of London. And it really wouldn't be until the middle of the 7th century that things started stabilizing again. And we'll talk all about that next week. So finally, I want to leave you with what I call phony London. So a couple things to be wary of when you're looking for Roman ruins in London. Now, on the left, I showed you part of the Roman wall. That is indeed really part of the Roman wall, but the bronze statue in front of it depicts the Emperor Trajan. He ruled from 98 to 117 AD. This is not a Roman statue. It was said to have been found on a dump in the early 1920s, and scholars believe it dates from about that time period, maybe a little earlier, but early 20th century. And if you look closely, and you can't see it in this image that I took, but if you go there yourself and look at it, you can actually see the head doesn't even match the body. It's actually two separate pieces. Now, not sure how this happened, but in 1980, the vicar of the nearby All Hallows by the Tower, he somehow came into possession of this statue of Trajan, and he got permission to put it in front of the Roman wall. So it's not genuine, but it kind of offsets the wall nicely. It interprets the history a little, and you can see Trajan kind of pointing to his wall behind him. The other non-Roman site is a fake bath, and this is on 5 Strand Lane. It's called the Roman Baths, and it was probably named so in the 1800s to attract Victorian tourists. But really, look at it. This is all it is. This is all it is. It's just this rectangular shape in the ground. Most likely, they think it dates from the 16th, 17th century, and they believe it was used to feed the gardens of nearby Somerset House. But the Victorians renamed it in the 1800s. You can still go visit it, but it's just a hole in the ground with some water in it. It's really not worth your time, in my opinion. Definitely not Roman in origin. Okay, so next week, we're going to be getting out of the basement, as it were. We'll leave these Roman ruins behind, and we'll journey into the Middle Ages or the medieval period. Now, like anything else in history, there's some debate about how we define this time period. For the sake of this course, I'm defining it as 500 AD to 1485, when Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, came to the throne. And again, we're going to be looking at a time of real chaos when London was subjected to waves of invasion and rule by various factions, including Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. And then finally, this guy, William, Duke of Normandy, also known as William the Conqueror. We'll look at some key historical incidences during this time period, a great pestilence, the Peasants' Revolt, that kind of thing. There's so much to cover in the medieval period, I'm actually breaking it into 2 weeks, but we will start launching it next week. Okay, so questions. Does anyone have questions? Let me start my video. I do see questions. Let me get out of my, hello. Why aren't you letting me out? Huh, weird. I can't get out of my, huh, very bizarre. Oh, there we go. Okay, stop sharing my screen. I do see there are some questions down in the chat. What are the physical, oh, Enfield, Peter, okay, cool. I've been to Enfield, not the, well, I've been to the Enfield here, but I've also been to the Enfield. I knew someone who lived in Enfield. The physical distances, that's a good question, Anne. I should know that and I'll have to get back to you. I can't remember the number of miles from one end to the other. Well, I can get that information to you. I'm not really sure right now. The mosaic slopes versus the current surface, was this on marshland which was subsided? Probably to a degree, yes, because it was very marshy down by the river on both sides, and they did shore a lot of that up. So, as I said, that was all fields until the 17th century, which is why it's still so well preserved. But it's not unlikely that it could have been kind of, we know it was very marshy over by Westminster, and we'll be talking about that when we get to the medieval period. Not so sure about Southwark, but not unlikely. And also just settlement over time, depending on where they found these. Budiccia. Yeah, I know. So there's a debate with historians of how this is pronounced.
Well,
but
we
yes,
pronounced it Boadicea.
oh, Budiccia, Cia. Okay, yeah, I've heard it pronounced like numerous ways.
Well, I don't know whether that was the Latin versus the whatever the language was locally, but I'm sure they don't even know. But
Yeah,
that's
and well, and again, historians, I've heard different historians call it different things. Even the tribe, her tribe, the Iceni, I've heard it called the Iceni, the Iceni by historians, by Roman. So even the classicists don't agree on all of this. So who knows? Not exactly sure, but that's, yes, very interesting. Yeah, Betsy.
So two-parter. Is
Yep.
there anything of historical significance in London that you have not seen?
Oh, well, that's a good question. There's always things to discover and find. In Greater London, I would say absolutely. Within the City of London, at least what has been found to date. Well, yeah, I mean, there are, because when we get to, there are some places you just can't see, so that aren't open to the public. So for instance, I've always wanted to be there and never managed to be there during what they call open house weekend. And every September they have an open house weekend. Huge long lines, hard to get tickets for. You have to start way in advance. But they open up some of the guild halls, which we're going to be talking about when we get to medieval London. And I've been dying to see the insides of some of those, not guild halls, some of the, oh God, I'm blanking on the name of them. The different livery companies, the different guilds who would have their own buildings. I would love to see the insides of some of those. Those are not open to the general public. So they're historic, but they're not open to the general public. I'd say what is available to see to date, I've pretty much scoured the city of London, that 1 square mile. They are constantly discovering new things. They're constantly finding new things when they dig stuff up. Greater London, there are still a few things that, are later in the time period, but still historic, that I probably have not seen yet, but I've seen a lot of it. Yeah.
So the second part is, what's your favorite?
Oh, wow. Wow. That's a really good question. I don't know if I have, I'm trying to think if there was anything that gave me the real wow factor where it just kind of hit me in the face and I went, wow.
Well, if somebody were traveling to London and only had limited time, what would
Yeah,
you
I think it
suggest?
depends, it depends on, there's a lot of variables. So if it's your first time going to London, obviously you have to hit the highlights. You have to do Westminster Abbey, St. Paul's, blah, blah, blah. If you've been there numerous times, what I tell people, or at least a few times, and you've done the highlights, you've done all the touristy things. I personally, my favorite part of London is the City of London, that 1 square mile. And the reason is, and we'll get into this a little more later in the course, but it's such an interesting, for me, conglomeration of the where London started. It still has parts of it still have a very medieval flavor in the sense that the buildings are no longer there because of the Great Fire of London, but lots of narrow little alleyways and things. So you can still kind of see the medieval footprint there. And I love that. And there's still vestiges of that. But it's also, which some people really hate, surrounded by the modern skyscrapers and I just find that juxtaposition really fascinating. And I do find all kinds of hidden little gems, which I will be talking about later in the city of London, dating from the medieval and Tudor period, that I really love. So for me, I can't think of one particular. I would say, the temple. It depends what you're interested in. If you're interested in Roman history, like today, Temple of Mithras is really quite interesting. That was quite educational, I felt. The bathhouse was, again, ruins, but kind of interesting. I found it interesting, but I'm also very interested. I mean, my background is English history, but I'm very interested in Roman history. So I really gravitated to those things, both because of London's history, but also because I'm interested in Roman history. Um, when we get later in the course, some of them are the things that we've seen before. I also like the other thing I recommend to people sometimes, but it depends on your taste. I do a separate course. I've got four-week courses that accompany the History of London one that I've done before. And one of them is on churches, London churches, and I love church architecture. So finding some of the churches that nobody goes to. And next week we are going to be looking at one of those, actually. Next week or the week after. I think it's the third week in the medieval period. We'll be looking at St. Bartholomew the Great. I love finding the places that nobody else goes to. But it really depends on what you're interested in. Some people couldn't care less about church architecture. Some people just want to spend time in museums. I do a course on museums. I do a course on historic houses. I do one on parks and gardens, and I do one on churches for London too. So then we get into much more detail on each of those. But it just, it kind of depends on our neighbors went for the first time a few months ago, and they were only there for a little over a week. And they really wanted to see the highlights, which they should, because they don't know if they're getting back, So yeah, it's a hard question to answer.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Oh, I came in on a different computer. You showed a picture of a dining room. Were those couches in the dining room? Did they lie down to eat?
Well, this is interesting. The conventional wisdom is yes, they would lie down to eat. And if you ever saw the TV series I, Claudius, there were a couple of dining scenes in that. And the rich people would be laying back while the servants kind of fed them the grapes and things. But there is a historian, a Roman historian by the name of Mary Beard, who is very popular, but also very controversial. She's probably about my age now, maybe a little bit younger, and she's very feisty and she's very opinionated. I really like her. But I just recently heard her talking about, and I've got to go back and find it because I just heard it on a BBC radio program. I'm like, I've got to go back and listen to this more carefully because it was on in the background. She was asserting they did not lie down when they ate because it had something to do with the hand they used to eat with. And she said, no, they would not have been lying down. They would not have been lying down. But I don't know where that opinion was coming from. I've got to go back and find that radio program again. She is very, very knowledgeable. I mean, she just retired, if you will, from Oxford University. She's written several, I'd say popular history books, not scholarly books, but very accessible history books for people who are interested in that time period. But yeah, I've got to go back and find it now because she was asserting, no. And I forgot what her rationale, something to do with the hand you ate with, or I don't know. But yeah, the conventional wisdom was, yes, they would be lounging on those. They'd be stretched out and leisurely eating dinner on those sofas. Yeah.
No
Also,
vomit.
you mentioned Tacitus, and that rang a bell with me because I taught German language and literature for many years. And he wrote a little book called Germania, and I just looked to see what was on Google, and it's different from my memory. I seem to remember hearing that he raved about German hospitality, among other things, and I seem to remember something about German women going naked into battle.
Bare-breasted. Yeah, there's lots of stories about the bare-breasted women going into battle.
Something about the noble savage, and that women were highly respected, and he raved about the morally wholesome aspect of these people.
Interesting. I've read some Tacitus, but not Germania. Huh, I'll have to look.
That marriage was sacred, and they didn't do what there was no infidelity to speak of.
Very interesting.
So I guess that was around the 1st century AD, first,
Yeah.
2nd century.
Yeah. Again, he was writing for, and for this, for Boudicca, whatever, he was writing obviously after the fact, but his father-in-law, that's why they thought his account was maybe more reliable. Cassius did tend to exaggerate a lot and tended to be he had a reputation for being a little bit loose with the facts. But in truth, neither one of the men were, eyewitnesses or living in London or anything like that at that time. But yeah, I saw another hand. Yeah, Betsy.
So no vomitoriums?
Did you know that, I think that's another thing that Mary Beard said, was that was also a myth, according to her. The vomitoriums, did you know, in theaters, in the modern day theaters, if you go to like the Hangar Theater or someplace, when you come in from the ground level, like at the Hangar, they have those 2 side entrances, not up in the balcony, but not up at the top, down.
Right.
Those are called the voms, for vomitorium. So the parlance, the theater parlance is the voms. They're called the voms. Yeah, kind of stolen from the Romans, but yeah. But no, Mary Beard asserted there were no vomitoriums either. Not sure. I've got to go back and find that radio interview, because it was quite interesting and it caught my attention, but I missed a lot of it because I was doing other things. But no, none in the dining rooms, in the villas that existed, that you can still see, like if you go to Pompeii, the ruins of the villas there and things that were buried under the no vomitoriums in dining rooms. No.
Oh, Seth has a question. She's been diligently.
Oh, sorry.
yeah.
I can't see anybody on here.
Well,
Yeah,
I
go
would
ahead.
just think that we'd know about the dining rooms, like if there were chairs in addition to we have actual remnants, right? We don't.
Yeah. Well, the
chair of the
furniture a lot of the furniture has been reproduced. I don't think furniture held up so well.
Right.
The
It wouldn't.
floors, that kind of thing. Yeah, but furniture, no, not so
But
much.
doesn't okay, in junior high school, I wanted to read the Satyricon, or at least I plucked out a paperback I got at the Satyricon somewhere, and my teacher wouldn't let me read it. I
Oh.
had no idea why at the time, of course. That's what,
Found out
anyway, he wouldn't
later.
let me read it. And I've never actually read it to this day. But doesn't it have like descriptions of the folks leaning back and like
Oh
in
yeah,
novels?
no, there are a lot of descriptions.
Yeah.
That's why I need to listen to what Mary
Right.
Beard,
And it's
what her
Bear,
assertion was.
Mary Bear,
Beard, B-E-A-R-D.
Beard.
Beard,
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
yeah. So not sure what
We
again,
just
she's
don't know.
she's a very funny woman. She's very funny.
Yeah.
I really like her a lot, but she's kind of controversial. She's always fighting with people on Twitter. She gets very feisty with people on Twitter. But not sure but yes, indeed, the descriptions, everything we know, were these sofas where they would lounge back and
Yeah.
and
But
eat
the
their food.
women sat on the edge.
Well, perhaps.
That's what
perhaps.
that
Yeah.
writes according to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the others would lounge back.
Yeah.
Not sure. I'm curious now. I want to find out. I want to know more. At least I want to know what you're thinking. Other questions, comments?
Other than to say thank you, Deb, as
Thank
always.
you.
Oh my goodness, it's so interesting.
Oh, well, you're welcome. You're welcome. You're very welcome.
And I know you've done this before, but dusting things off is not an insignificant task.
Well, I do have
Yeah.
to go through, I always go through and I always find like 1 or 2 things I have to tweak. And of course, with the Museum of London, the last time I taught this, the Museum of London was still where the Museum of London is now, or was, but now it's, now it's in the process of moving, and they always find new things. That's the other thing. The first time I taught this course, they had not found those mosaics in Southwark, so I had to add that in the next time I taught. So yeah, whenever I teach something for a second, third, fourth, however many times, I always go back through and look at everything again. And I'm constantly keeping up with what's happening over there. So I'm often finding new things to add. It's just that the hardest part is the time frame you have to present in and trying to squeeze in as much as possible in a short.
We
in a short
we
time.
appreciate it, that's for sure. So,
Well, I enjoy doing it, and I appreciate you taking time. You know, time is precious, so I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me babble on. Patiently listen to me babble on.
So
Right.
what is the next, maybe you should announce the date. I mean, I know it's on the
They're
calendar.
every Wednesday. They're every Wednesday at 2 p.m. So it's going to be the second course is a little different. So the History of London one is going to be consecutive Wednesdays at 2 p.m. So every Wednesday morning you'll get that email from the office with a link. And the handouts will be again on the website, a couple different places on the website, and they'll go out via email, links to those. After this, in March, I believe, I'm taking a couple weeks break. And then in March, I'm doing a course on Queen Consorts of Great Britain. I just randomly selected some that are not as well known as others. That one's getting spaced out every other week. So you won't be afflicted with every single Wednesday. It'll take longer, it'll stretch out, but that one's going to be stretched out. But this one is every Wednesday at 2 p.m. for the next 7 weeks now that we finished.
So I won't be at the next one, but because I have an appointment, but I will do my homework and I will watch your.
There's no home, you don't have to worry about the homework, but you
darn.
don't have to read any of the stuff that, I mean, that's just additional information for people if they want it. But yeah, great, wonderful.
So
Okay. Yep.
Deb, just a quick question. Nobody else might be interested in this, but I was curious. That walled garden where you had to, where is that? Is that near St. Paul's?
No, it's right by the Museum of London. It's on London Wall. The road is called London Wall. So it's by the old Museum of London. I say the old museum because they've vacated the building now, and I think it's going to be. I think I read they were going to. I can't remember what they're doing with it. If they're turning it into apartments or office building or something, but it's right near. It's right around the corner from there. It's right next to there. Yep. Anything else?
Thank you.
Well,
Yes.
thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Where is the new Museum of London?
The new Museum of London is not that far away. It's also in the city. It's in Smithfield, the old Smithfield markets.
Oh,
So Smithfield Market and Billingsgate Fish Market and the old Spitalfields Market, very controversially, are all being combined into one large market way out in Greater London. Well, the Billingsgate Market has already moved off long ago, but Smithfield and Spitalfields were still there, but they're all being combined. So the Museum of London bought that space, and they're in the process of, and I think I gave you, I think I did. I think if you look at the handouts, one of them has a link to the project website with kind of drawings and things of how they're thinking of doing the new museum in Smithfields. So yeah, and we're going to be looking at Smithfields, I believe next week or the week after. We're going to be looking at that area anyway. But yeah, it's over there. That's where they're going. And they're going to close. They're closed. Gosh, I don't know, for 3 years, 4 years. It's an undertaking, so it's going to be a while. You can still go on their website and look at things, but you can't. Obviously, physically, you can't go in the museum for quite some time. All right, everybody, it's 3:30.
Electronic calendars. I just got you on for the next 8 weeks.
Oh, okay, great.
Actually,
Andrew,
I got you on to eternity, but when the course stops.
I'm not sure I'm going to commit to that long.
Thank you
All right,
again.
everyone. See most of you next week. Bye-bye. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.